Hello, and welcome to our video about 18th century art and culture. In this video, we'll touch on the Baroque and the Rococo movement, and then we'll transition over to looking at what changes, which is the Neoclassical movement. And overall, kind of what are the big effects of this new artistic style and culture? The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment are going to move society to be a bit more secular or just kind of non religious. We do see the rise of some new belief systems during this era. We see deism, which remember is just kind of like, they believe in a God that created the universe, but they don't think he interacts with people on in their day-to-day lives. Atheism, the absence of a God or higher power, and then skepticism, just this idea of like constantly questioning religion, the world, kind of everything. And then we see through this kind of de-Christianization movement in Europe, there are new kind of sects of Christianity that are being developed. And one of the main ones is going to be Methodism. The Methodist Church founded by John Wesley, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a later video. But just this idea that the new Christian movements that do develop focus on more of a personal relationship with God, and they become very popular with the working class. We'll also start to see more religious toleration begin to increase across Europe. Which brings us to the first artistic style we'll talk about today, Baroque and Rococo. Now, we've already talked about Baroque art and music before in this class, but we'll kind of emphasize again what are the main characteristics. We see their art and music is going to be very ornate and extravagant. So, this is going to be kind of pre Enlightenment, the style that we'll see. We'll see a lot of the art valued and promoted the church. And the Rococo movement emphasizes all of this with even more kind of detail and color. And we'll look here at some examples of those, artist work here in a second. Now, this first painting we're going to look at is done by Velázquez, and it's called Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor. And it's this famous painting that was made in 1656, so again, pre-Enlightenment, considered one of his most influential works. It looks at the kind of princess Margarita, daughter of Philip VI, surrounded by all of her ladies in waiting in her room. And he even puts himself in the picture. You can see himself painting, over there on the left side. And the mirror in the back shows the figures of the king and queen, suggesting that they're kind of observing all of this work. And so the painting reflects the dramatic and ornate style of the Baroque period with its use of light and shadow and its complex compositions. Our next example of Baroque art is going to be this piece by Bernini. It's the Baldacchino, and it's this large bronze canopy located inside St. Peter's Basilica. It's a Vatican City, and it marks the location of St. Peter's tomb. So it stands over this high altar, and it's kind of the main feature there in the basilica. And the designs that Bernini uses incorporates those elements of Baroque art, including dynamic movement and grandeur, and it's positioned in the center of the basilica's crossing, like right under the dome. So you really can't miss it. And it's supposed to mark the tomb of St. Peter. Okay, so those were both great examples of what art looked like in the Baroque period before the Enlightenment. But now we're going to transition into the neoclassical movement that takes place during the Enlightenment. Many artists during the Enlightenment period are going to be opposed to all of the excess of the Baroque and the Rococo styles. And they want to go back to more classic structures, very clean, simplistic lines inspired by the Greeks and Romans. And so they're going to value reason and secularism. You're going to see that there's less religious influence than there was in the previous era. You're going to see music becomes more secular as well. The music's not going to be composed for the church as much. It's going to be more composed for the people to listen to. We also see that literature expands tremendously during this time. One really famous neoclassical artist is this man named Jacques Louis David. And we'll look at a few different pieces of his work in this video, but this is one of the first ones. So it's called The Death of Socrates, and it describes, that scene where Socrates says, if you can prove me wrong using my own logic, I'll take hemlock and poison myself. And that's what this is. So it's going back to like literally kind of Greek times and reimagining scenes from that time period. Our next example by this artist is going to be a piece that he actually paints during the French Revolution that depicts a similar style, but this one's actually a big propaganda piece for the French Revolution. So this is called The Death of Marat, and it depicts the assassination of this man named Jean-Paul Marat. And he's a radical figure in the French Revolution, and he gets stabbed in his bathtub. And so you see him holding that like lettering quill immediately after being stabbed, and it's used as this powerful piece of propaganda that creates merit into kind of a martyr. So we see the use of art influencing politics of this time too. And then finally, we have one of his paintings, it's probably one of the most famous ones from our perspective, which is the Coronation of Napoleon. And this shows us kind of that neoclassical style through its clear composition and balanced symmetry and its idealized figures. Like these people, they look very realistic. They haven't been painted over to look better than they are. It depicts the scene kind of as he saw it. He was there at Napoleon's coronation. And it showcases kind of that emphasis on realism that the neoclassical movement has. And then the final thing I wanted to point out with painting during this time period, the neoclassical era, is that some of it's going to be influenced by the commercial revolution. So that idea that people are buying more consumer goods and they're going to kind of use that in their art. So Vermeer, one of our Dutch painters we've looked at in the past, his paintings are an example of that. So we see this girl who has clothes on that she would have had to purchase that came probably from a faraway market. And then you look at her jewelry, the pearls, those also would have come from someplace else that her family would have bought for her. So this idea that the consumer revolution is being kind of portrayed in art during this time period as well. Now, it's not just paintings that are becoming kind of neoclassical. We also see neoclassical architecture in kind of grand scale during this time period too. So this is a picture of the Pantheon in Paris. So it was built between 1758 to 1790, and originally it's supposed to be a church, but by the time the construction was finished, the French Revolution had started, and they vote instead to turn it into a mausoleum for the remains of kind of the most distinguished French citizens. And it's modeled after the Pantheon in Rome. But we see those classical kind of domes and columns that you would have seen in more Roman and Greek architecture. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris is also an example of this. I mean, you can literally see the figures at the top. They're supposed to be leading in, the army. Those look like Greek or Roman, people. They don't look like people from the French Revolution era. And this architectural style doesn't just stop there. We see a lot of this influence in America in Washington, D.C. as well. The Supreme Court building, the White House, the House of Congress, all of those have some of those elements in there, whether it's the columns, the very Greek Roman structure of the buildings, the domes, all of that stuff. And then our example for neoclassical music will be Mozart. So his music emphasizes order and balance. Shares a lot of stylistic features and sensibilities of the neoclassical movement. And he's just kind of going to influence a lot of later composers to do the same in this similar style. And then new literature develops. So we see the creation of genres like political satires, melodramas, and the modern novel as we know it. And it's heavily influenced by older Roman writers. Some of those famous authors that you'll see in this time period would be like Daniel Defoe with Robinson Crusoe, Alexander Pope, Goethe, and then Jane Austen with Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. And these books often talk about kind of the moral quandaries of their time. They do a lot of logic and reason as well as imaginative kind of leanings. So they become very popular in kind of the mainstream, not just with elites. And then finally, we start to see more consumer goods entering into everyday people's lives. So, with the consumer revolution, the middle class has more money to spend and they want to show their elevated status. So, they start buying things for their homes. Specifically, we see things like porcelain dishes, cotton linens for home decor, mirrors, and different prints, like, art prints that will now be in people's homes to show off their individual kind of styles and tastes. So, knowing all of this about the neoclassical movement, what does that mean for the future? It means that new ideas in art and culture are going to help diversify the beliefs of the people in Europe. So, new ideas are going to spread through things like newspapers and periodicals, books, pamphlets. And while governments will try to censor those things, they're not going to be able to stop all these new ideas from spreading. And it'll make people more interconnected than they've ever been before. And in many ways, the art of this time period is going to either reflect or reject what's happening in society during this time. And it's going to be a lot of societal commentary. And that wraps up our video today about 18th century art and culture. Thanks for watching.